The pen moves across cheap paper. The scratching sound is the only thing in the room besides the distant hum of Lisbon traffic 4 floors below. The man holding the pen is small, ordinary, forgettable. His name is Juan Pujol Garcia, and he is writing a letter that could get him killed before sunrise. He does not stop. He does not tremble. He writes as if possessed because in a way he is. He is possessed by a hatred so pure it has burned away everything else in his life. His family, his safety, his future, all of it sacrificed for this moment, for this letter, for this insane gamble that began not here in Portugal, but 2 years earlier in the rubble of Barcelona. The Spanish Civil War ended in 1939, but for Pujol it never really ended. He still wakes some nights with the smell of gunpowder in his nose. He still sees the faces of men dragged from their homes, shot against walls, buried in ditches. He survived by being nothing, by being no one, by becoming invisible. He ran a poultry farm. He watched the fascists march past his window. He watched them celebrate, and something inside him hardened into stone. He made a decision. He would fight them. Not with a gun. He had seen what guns do. He would fight them with his mind. It was the only weapon he had. In early 1941, he walked into the British Embassy in Madrid. He wore his only clean shirt. He waited in line behind refugees and businessmen and women with desperate eyes. When his turn came, he stood before a young diplomat with polished shoes and an expression of permanent boredom. Pujol explained his plan in halting French. He would go to Germany. He would pretend to be a Nazi sympathizer. He would infiltrate the Abwehr and report everything to Britain. He asked for nothing except the chance to serve. The diplomat listened for perhaps 3 minutes. Then he thanked Pujol and showed him to the door. The interview was over. Pujol had been dismissed like a man asking for a job, cleaning latrines. He tried again. A different official, a different day, the same result. The British did not want him. They did not need a Spanish poultry farmer with no training, no connections, no languages. They looked at him and saw nothing. A nobody from nowhere. They told him to go home. Most men would have gone home. Most men would have accepted that they were small and powerless, and the world would roll over them no matter what they did. But Pujol was not most men. He stood on the street outside the British Embassy in Madrid and felt something rising in his chest. Not despair, not anger, something colder, something harder, a kind of joy. Because he understood something the diplomats did not. The world is not made of facts. It is made of stories. And if you control the story, you control everything. The British had rejected his offer to spy for them. Fine. He would spy for them anyway. He would become a double agent without the first half of the deal. He would go to the Germans, convince them he was their man, and then feed their lies to Britain whether Britain wanted them or not. It was insane, it was suicidal, it was the only path left. He transformed himself. He became the thing he hated. He visited cafes known for Nazi sympathy. He praised German discipline. He condemned British decadence. He let it slip that he was a former phalangist, a true believer, a man who had fought for Franco, and now wanted to continue the fight against the British Empire. The Abwehr was always hungry for Spanish recruits. Spain was neutral, but Franco owed everything to Hitler. The Germans operated openly in Madrid. They recruited from the frustrated, the bitter, the ambitious. Pujol looked like all three. A man named Friedrich Knapperati took an interest. a German intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover. They met in a dim apartment outside the city center. Naparati questioned him for hours about his politics, his family, his knowledge of Britain. Pujol lied with the calm of a man who had spent his whole life learning to hide. He told them he could go to London. He had contacts there. He could build a network. He could send reports. Naparati was impressed, not by his experience because there was none, but by his certainty, his hunger. In the spy game, enthusiasm is easily mistaken for reliability. The Abwehr gave him money, a codebook, a train ticket to Lisbon, and instructions to make his way to England. They gave him a name, Alaric. Pujol took the train to Lisbon. He got off. He checked into a cheap pension on a narrow street where laundry hung from every window like flags of surrender. He never got on the boat to England. He had no intention of going to London. He knew no one there. He spoke almost no English. He would be arrested within a week. Instead, he sat down on the thin mattress of his rented room and began to build an empire. He bought a tourist guide to Britain. He bought a railway timetable. He bought a map of the British Isles and pinned it to the wall with nails he hammered using the heel of his shoe. He went to the public library and read newspapers 3 months out of date. He noted names of factories, movements of ships, mentions of troop deployments. He studied British life like an anthropologist studying a lost tribe. He learned that the British queue for buses, that they drink tea at specific hours, that they complain endlessly about rain. He absorbed every trivial detail he could find because he understood something fundamental about lying. The devil is in the details. God is in the details. Everything is in the details. Then he began to write. His first report to the Abwehr described his fictional journey to London, the blackouts, the nervous soldiers at Victoria Station, the stoic civilians with their gas masks and their cups of tea. He described his first fictional agent, a wealthy Swiss businessman who traveled frequently between Britain and the continent. Then he added another. A Venezuelan student living in Glasgow, a nationalist who hated the British and reported on ship movements in the Clyde. Then another. A disgruntled Welsh communist who worked as a radio operator and fed him scraps of military gossip from his barracks. He gave each of them names, ages, personalities. He gave them weaknesses. The Venezuelan drank too much. The Welshman was bitter about his divorce. The Swiss was greedy, always asking for more money. These details were the currency of espionage. They made the lies breathe. They made the lies real. He sent his first coded letter to his German handler in Madrid. He signed it with a new operational name, one he had chosen himself because he liked the sound of it. Arabelle. Weeks passed. The money from the Abwehr arrived regularly. Pujol stayed in his pension, writing, inventing, weaving a web of deception that stretched across the Atlantic. He wrote reports based on newsreels he watched in cinemas. He wrote reports based on conversations overheard in cafes, conversations in languages he barely understood, but whose emotional tone he could read like music. He wrote reports based on nothing at all, pure invention, pure fiction, and then he held his breath and waited to see if anyone would notice. No one noticed. The Germans in Madrid forwarded his reports to Berlin. Berlin praised Madrid. Madrid praised Naparati. And Naparati praised the diligent little Spaniard who was single-handedly building a spy ring inside the heart of the British Empire. They raised his salary. They asked for more. They told him he was their best agent in Britain. Pujol read their letters in his tiny room and felt something he had not felt since before the war. He felt powerful. He felt alive. He felt that all the deaths he had witnessed, all the fear he had swallowed, all the humiliation of being dismissed by the British, all of it was leading somewhere. But in Berlin, in a massive concrete building where maps covered entire walls, German intelligence officers pored over his reports and made decisions based on them. Decisions about troop movements, about supply routes, about where to send submarines and aircraft and divisions of soldiers. They did not know they were reading fiction. They did not know their best agent was a man in a cheap pension eating cold soup from a tin. They believed. Because the details were right. Because the names sounded real. Because Pujol understood something the Germans, for all their efficiency, did not. People want to believe. They want the story that makes sense. Give them that story and they will fill in the gaps themselves. Months passed. Pujol grew bolder. He invented more agents. He invented a network of 27 sub-agents spread across Britain. He gave them addresses, though he had no idea what those addresses looked like. He gave them jobs, though he had never set foot in a British factory or office. He invented their wives and their mistresses and their grudges. He invented their favorite pubs and their drinking habits, and the way they took their tea. He built a world inside his head, and then he mailed that world to Berlin, and Berlin paid him for the privilege of being deceived. There were moments of terror, moments when he realized one mistake could unravel everything. What if a German agent in Lisbon, a real agent, visited the addresses he had given? What if they tried to contact his fictional people? What if they checked the ship movements he described against actual records? On those nights, Pujol could not sleep. He lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to every footstep in the hallway, waiting for the knock that would end everything. The knock never came. The Germans never checked. They trusted him. They wanted to trust him. He had given them a story they needed to hear. In the spring of 1942, something changed. Pujol noticed a shift in the German messages. They were asking different questions, more specific questions about Normandy, about coastal defenses, about where an invasion might come. He did not know it yet, but the war was entering a new phase. Germany had conquered most of Europe. Now they were looking west, across the Channel, at the one enemy they had not defeated, Britain. And they wanted to know when the counterattack would come. Pujol sat in his room, the map of Britain staring down at him, and realized the game had just become infinitely more dangerous. He was no longer just a man sending lies about ship movements and troop trains. He was becoming something else, a player in the largest military operation of the 20th century. He did not know how he would survive it. He did not know if he would survive it. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would keep writing. He would keep inventing. He would keep building his imaginary empire because it was the only thing that made the war, made his life, made any of it mean something. And then, on an April afternoon, the knock finally came. Not the Germans. Different footsteps, harder, more confident. Pujol opened the door to find two men in civilian clothes. They were British. He knew it instantly, the way they stood, the way their eyes moved, taking in the room, the map, the stack of papers on the table. One of them spoke in French. He identified himself as an officer of MR5. He said they had been tracking German intelligence traffic. they had noticed anomalies. Reports that were accurate enough to be dangerous but just wrong enough to be useless. They had traced those reports to Lisbon, to this pension, to this room, to him. Pujol looked at them. He did not run. He did not reach for a weapon. He had no weapon. He had only his mind, his invention, his 27 imaginary friends. He looked at the British officers, and he smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting 2 years for someone to finally find him. He said, in his broken French, that he was glad they had come. He said he had been trying to contact them for a very long time. He said he was their agent. He always had been. The Germans thought he worked for them, but he had built this entire network, this entire world, for Britain. For them. He gestured at the room, the map, the stacks of coded messages ready to be sent to Berlin. He said it was all a gift. A gift he had been trying to give them for 2 years. The 2 officers looked at the room, the tourist guide to Britain, the railway timetable, the map covered in pins marking the locations of agents who did not exist. They looked at each other. They had come to arrest a spy. They had found something else entirely. A ghost, a madman, a genius. They did not know which yet. But they knew one thing. The war had just acquired a new weapon. And his name was Juan Pujol Garcia, the man who talked himself into war, the man who built an army from paper and ink, the man who was about to convince Adolf Hitler that the invasion of Europe would come not where it was really coming, but somewhere else entirely, somewhere cold and distant and utterly wrong. The British officers who knocked on Juan Pujol's door that April afternoon in 1942 did not know what they had found. They only knew that the German intelligence traffic they had been monitoring contained a name that kept appearing, a source designated as Arabelle, whose reports were too detailed, too confident, too strangely accurate in their inaccuracies to be ignored. They had traced the source to Lisbon, expecting to find a hardened German spy, perhaps a professional Abwehr officer with years of training and a network of contacts across the neutral capital. What they found instead was a small, nervous Spanish man in a cheap pension surrounded by library books and tourist guides and a map of Britain covered in hand-drawn markings that looked like the work of a child playing war games. The lead officer was a man named Thomas Harris. He was young for intelligence work, barely 30, with the face of a scholar and the eyes of someone who had learned to read people the way others read books. Harris had been born in Chile, raised in London, educated in languages and art and the subtle mathematics of deception. He understood that truth was not a single thing, but a spectrum, a range of possibilities that shifted depending on who was looking and what they wanted to see. Standing in Pujol's cramped room, surrounded by the physical evidence of the most elaborate one-man intelligence operation the war had yet produced, Harris felt something he had rarely felt in his career. He felt awe. The story Pujol told over the next hours was so improbable that no fiction writer would have dared to invent it. He explained how the British had rejected him twice, how he had gone to the Germans out of desperation, how he had built his network of imaginary agents from nothing but library research and intuition and an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on madness. He showed Harris the stack of reports he had sent to Berlin, each one a careful blend of fact and fiction designed to be believable, useful, and ultimately harmless. He showed the replies from his German handlers, letters full of praise and encouragement and requests for more. He showed the money they had sent, receipts for payments that had kept him alive in Lisbon while he built his invisible empire. Harris listened without interrupting. He asked questions only when Pujol paused, questions that probed the edges of the story, testing for inconsistencies, for the small cracks that would reveal a liar working for the other side. There were no cracks. The story held. It held because it was true, but also because Pujol told it with the passion of a man who had been carrying a secret so long it had become heavier than any physical burden. By the time the sun set over Lisbon, painting the room in shades of orange and red, Harris had made a decision. This man was not a German agent. He was not a British agent either, not yet. But he was something rare, something precious. He was a weapon waiting to be aimed. Getting Pujol out of Portugal was the first challenge. Lisbon was crawling with German agents, Abwehr officers, Gestapo informants, all of them watching for exactly this kind of movement. If the Germans discovered that their star agent Arabelle had been meeting with British intelligence, the game would end before it truly began. Pujol would be killed, or worse, turned back against the British in some elaborate counter-deception that no one would see coming until it was too late. Harris arranged for a false passport, a new identity, a circuitous route that took Pujol through Gibraltar under cover of darkness, then by ship to England, always moving, always hiding, always looking over his shoulder for the shadow that would mean discovery and death. Pujol arrived in London in the late spring of 1942. He had never seen the city he had been describing to the Germans for over a year. He had never walked its streets, never heard its sounds, never smelled its particular mixture of coal smoke and rain and the green damp of English parks. Now he stood on the platform at Paddington Station, a small Spanish man in a borrowed coat, surrounded by the bustle of a city at war. Soldiers in uniform hurried past with kit bags over their shoulders. Women in factory overalls carried lunch pails and newspapers. The windows of the station were taped against bomb blast, a crisscross pattern that turned the daylight into diamonds on the floor. Pujol looked at it all and felt something he could not name. He had come home to a place he had never been. Harris arranged for a safe house in North London, a modest flat in a quiet neighborhood where Pujol could live and work without attracting attention. The flat had 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen, a sitting room with a view of the street. It was ordinary, unremarkable, exactly the kind of place where no one would look for a spy. Pujol moved in with a single suitcase containing his codebooks, his maps, and the letters from his German handlers that he had kept as proof of his strange success. He sat on the edge of the bed in his new room and looked out the window at the English rain falling on an English street and wondered if he would ever feel safe again. The work began immediately. Harris understood that Pujol could not simply stop being Arabelle. The Germans expected reports. They expected the steady flow of intelligence that had made their agent in London so valuable. If the report stopped, they would investigate. They would wonder. They might discover the truth. So the reports had to continue, but now they would be written under British control, with British approval, for British purposes. Pujol would become a double agent in truth, not just in intention. He would feed the Germans what London wanted them to hear, and he would do it so skillfully that they would never suspect they were being deceived. The first task was the most difficult. Pujol had to explain to his German handlers why his reports had suddenly become less frequent, less detailed, less useful. He could not tell them he had moved to England, because that would raise questions about how he had made the journey and why he had not informed them sooner. He could not tell them he had been sick, because they might send someone to check. He had to invent a story that would satisfy their curiosity without raising their suspicion. A story rooted in the same careful detail that had made his fictional network so believable. He wrote to them about the bombing. The Blitz had devastated London, he explained. His agents were scattered, frightened, difficult to contact. The Venezuelan in Glasgow had moved and not left a forwarding address. The Welsh radio operator had been transferred to a new unit somewhere in the north of England. The Swiss businessman had temporarily returned to Zurich to wait out the worst of the bombing. The network was not destroyed, Pujol assured them, but it was disrupted. It would take time to rebuild, to reconnect, to resume the flow of intelligence they had come to expect. He asked for their patience and their continued support. He promised that when the network was fully operational again, the reports would be better than ever. The Germans wrote back with sympathy and understanding. They told him to take whatever time he needed. They increased his salary to compensate for the difficulties he was facing. They reminded him that he was their most valued agent in Britain, that Berlin had noticed his work, that his future with the Abwehr was bright if he continued to serve with the same dedication he had shown since the beginning. Pujol read their letters in his North London flat and felt a strange mixture of triumph and terror. They believed him. They always believed him. The question was how long he could make them believe. Thomas Harris became more than a handler. He became a partner, a collaborator, a friend. The two men spent hours together in the safe flat, mapping out strategy, discussing the psychology of their German targets, inventing new agents and new scenarios that would feed the enemy exactly what British intelligence wanted them to know. Harris understood that Pujol's gift was not just for invention, but for understanding. He knew what the Germans wanted to hear, because he had spent years studying them, not as enemies, but as human beings, with hopes and fears and blind spots, like everyone else. He knew that they wanted to believe Britain was weak, divided, vulnerable. He knew they wanted to believe their spies were effective, their intelligence reliable, their war effort justified. He gave them what they wanted, and they thanked him for it. The network grew. Pujol added new agents, each one more detailed, more alive than the last. There was a businessman in Liverpool who reported on ship movements in the Mersey. There was a secretary in the Ministry of Information who typed important documents and left carbon copies where her Venezuelan contact could find them. There was a disgruntled sergeant in the Royal Army Service Corps who hated his officers and sold information for gin and cigarettes. There was an American soldier stationed in East Anglia who wrote letters home complaining about the British and included details his censors should have caught but never did. Each of these people existed only in Pujol's imagination, but to the Germans, they were as real as any agent on their payroll. The reports went out by radio and by letter, encoded in systems the British had approved and the Germans believed unbreakable. The Abwehr received them, decoded them, forwarded them to Berlin. In the massive concrete building, where German military intelligence had its headquarters, analysts studied the reports from Arabelle and incorporated them into their assessments of British strength and British intentions. They did not know they were studying fiction. They did not know that the man they trusted most was sitting in a flat in North London, drinking tea with a British intelligence officer, laughing at how easy it was to fool the masters of Europe. But there were moments when the laughter stopped. Moments when Pujol lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps that were not there. Moments when he wondered if this time he had gone too far, invented too much, pushed the fiction past the point of believability. The Germans were not stupid. They had their own sources, their own checks, their own ways of verifying information. What if one of his imaginary agents was mentioned in a real newspaper? What if a German spy in Lisbon visited an address he had given and found nothing but empty space? What if Berlin sent someone to London to make contact with Arabelle in person, to see the network with their own eyes, to shake the hand of the man who had given them so much? The fear was always there, a constant presence in the background of every day. But the work continued. The reports went out. The money kept coming. The Germans kept believing. And slowly, imperceptibly, the game began to change. The questions from Berlin became more specific, more urgent. They wanted to know about troop concentrations in the south of England. They wanted to know about landing craft, about training exercises, about the ports where an invasion force might assemble. They wanted to know when the Allies would strike and where, and with how much force. Pujol and Harris looked at each other across the table in the North London flat and understood that something enormous was approaching. The war was entering its final phase. Germany had been stopped in Russia, pushed back in Africa, squeezed from both ends by enemies who refused to surrender. Now the only question was when and where the Western Allies would deliver the killing blow. The Germans needed to know. They needed it desperately, and they believed they had a source who could tell them. Juan Pujol Garcia, the poultry farmer from Barcelona, the rejected volunteer, the man who had built an empire of lies from a single room in Lisbon, was about to become the most important double agent in the history of warfare. He did not know it yet. He only knew that the game was getting bigger, the stakes higher, the danger more intense. He sat in his flat in North London, surrounded by maps and code books, and the letters from men who trusted him with their secrets. And he waited for whatever would come next. The waiting did not last long. In the summer of 1943, a message arrived from Berlin that changed everything. It was addressed to Arabelle personally, marked urgent, encoded in the highest level of Abwehr cipher. Pujol decoded it with hands that trembled slightly, though he would never admit it later. The message was simple. Berlin had learned of a massive Allied buildup in the north of Scotland. They had heard rumors of an invasion force preparing to strike at Norway. They needed confirmation. They needed details. They needed Arabelle to activate every agent in his network and find out everything he could about the plans for an assault on the Norwegian coast. Pujol read the message twice. Then he read it a third time. Norway. They were asking about Norway. Thousands of miles from where the real invasion would eventually come. Thousands of miles from Normandy, from Calais, from the beaches where the Allies were actually planning to land. The Germans were worried about Norway. Hitler was obsessed with Norway, with its fjords and its ports, and its strategic position on the northern flank of Europe. He kept divisions there, dozens of divisions, that could have been fighting on the Eastern Front or defending France. And now he wanted to know if the Allies were coming for them. Pujol looked at Harris. Harris looked at Pujol. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then Harris smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a hunter who has just seen his prey walk into a trap so perfect, so elegant, that it almost seemed too good to be true. The second great deception had begun. The message from Berlin about Norway arrived in the summer of 1943, and for the first time since the game began, Juan Pujol felt something close to panic. Not because the question was difficult. He could invent answers to any question, could spin fiction from air itself, had done it so many times that the process had become almost automatic. The panic came from something else, something deeper and more dangerous. He realized that the Germans were no longer just consuming his reports as one source among many. They were relying on him. They were building strategy around his information. They were moving divisions, committing resources, making life and death decisions based on the words he wrote in a flat in North London, while rain tapped against the windows, and Thomas Harris watched him with those calm, assessing eyes. The responsibility was enormous. It was also terrifying. Pujol had started this game to satisfy something inside himself, a need to fight back against the fascists who had destroyed his country and murdered his neighbors. He had never expected to become this important. He had never expected that his lies would carry the weight of armies. Now he sat at his table with Berlin's message in front of him, and understood that from this moment forward, every word he wrote would have consequences he could not fully control or predict. Harris understood this too. He was the calm one, the anchor, the man who could look at the most complex deception and see the simple geometry beneath. He explained to Pujol that Norway was not just another target. It was an obsession. Hitler believed Norway was the decisive theater, the place where the war would be won or lost. He had said it himself, many times, in conversations that British intelligence had intercepted and analyzed. Norway was Germany's lifeline for Swedish iron ore. Norway was the base for submarines and surface raiders attacking the Atlantic convoys. Norway was the northern fortress that must be held at all costs. The Führer had personally ordered that more troops be stationed there than any reasonable military analysis would suggest. He kept divisions in Norway that could have stopped the Red Army at Kursk or crushed the Allied landings in Sicily. He kept them there because he was afraid. Fear was the key. Harris explained it to Pujol in language so simple it sounded like a children's lesson. The Germans were not stupid. They were not easily fooled. But they were afraid. They were afraid of the unknown, afraid of the unexpected, afraid of the second front that they knew must eventually come. Their fear made them hungry for information. Their fear made them vulnerable to anyone who could tell them what they wanted to hear. And what they wanted to hear was that their fears were justified, that the danger was real, that the precautions they had taken were necessary. Give them that, and they would believe anything. Pujol began to write. He activated his network, every imaginary agent, every fictional source, every invented contact who had been waiting in the wings for just such a moment. The Venezuelan in Glasgow reported strange activity in the Clyde shipyards. crates marked for cold weather operations, discussions of Arctic clothing and winter equipment. The Welsh radio operator overheard conversations about mountain warfare training, about exercises in the Scottish Highlands that mimicked Norwegian terrain. The secretary in the Ministry of Information typed memos about diplomatic preparations for dealing with the Norwegian government in exile, about meetings between British and Norwegian officers, about the quiet planning that preceded any major operation. The American soldier wrote letters home, mentioning that his unit was drawing winter gear in the middle of summer, that everyone was speculating about where they would go, that the rumors all pointed north. Each report was a small piece of a larger picture. Each report was carefully calibrated to be believable, to fit with what the Germans already thought they knew, to confirm their fears without triggering their suspicion. Pujol did not claim to have definitive proof of an invasion. He only reported what his agents were seeing and hearing, the fragments of information that accumulated into a pattern. The pattern said Norway. The pattern said soon. The pattern said the Allies were coming for Hitler's northern fortress, and nothing could stop them. Berlin's response was immediate and electric. The Abwehr forwarded Pujol's reports to the High Command, with urgent markings and personal recommendations. The High Command forwarded them to Hitler's headquarters, to the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, where the Führer studied maps and discussed strategy with generals who had long since learned not to contradict him. Hitler read the reports from Arabelle and saw his fears confirmed. He had always known the Allies would target Norway. He had always known the northern flank was the most vulnerable. Now his best agent in Britain had provided the proof. The orders went out within days. Divisions that had been preparing to move to France were rerouted to Norway. Battleships that could have threatened the Normandy beaches were sent to Norwegian fjords. Construction crews accelerated work on coastal defenses, on gun emplacements, on the fortifications that would make Norway impregnable. The Germans moved 13 divisions into position, over 300,000 men, with tanks and artillery and aircraft and all the vast machinery of modern war. They positioned them to defend against an invasion that would never come. In London, Pujol and Harris tracked the German movements through intercepted communications and intelligence reports. They watched as division after division disappeared into the Norwegian wilderness, committed to a phantom threat that existed only in the mind of a Spanish poultry farmer and the fears of a German dictator. They did not celebrate. There was no time for celebration, no room for the kind of satisfaction that ordinary men might feel. They only felt the pressure increase, the stakes rise, the danger grow more intense with every passing day. Because now the Germans were committed. Now they had invested too much in Norway to easily change course. But they would not stop asking questions. They would not stop demanding more information, more confirmation, more details that would justify the massive commitment of resources they had already made. And if Pujol's reports ever contradicted each other, if his imaginary agents ever said something that did not fit, if the pattern ever broke, the Germans would notice. They would investigate. They would discover the truth. And then, the 300,000 men in Norway would be released to fight somewhere else, somewhere real, somewhere they could make a difference. Pujol wrote on. He invented new agents to cover new angles. He invented a Norwegian businessman who traveled between London and Stockholm and reported on Allied planning. He invented a Swedish diplomat whose mistress talked too much after too much wine. He invented a Canadian officer who boasted about Arctic training exercises to anyone who would listen. The network grew until it was almost too complex for one man to manage, but Pujol managed it. He kept every detail in his head, every name, every location, every scrap of invented biography that made his people real. He became the god of a world that existed only in his mind, and he populated that world with characters who would help him save the world that was real. The strain was enormous. Pujol began to have trouble sleeping. He would lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, running through the details of his network, checking for inconsistencies, for weaknesses, for anything the Germans might find. He would imagine scenarios, conversations, meetings between his fictional agents and real people who might accidentally expose them. He would wake in cold sweats, certain that he had made a mistake, that this time he had gone too far, that the knock on the door would come before morning. The knock never came. The Germans never found the flaw. But the fear never left him either. Harris noticed the strain. He tried to help, to share the burden, to take some of the weight onto his own shoulders. But there was only so much he could do. He could help craft the strategy, could analyze the German responses, could provide the resources Pujol needed to maintain his fiction. But he could not write the reports. He could not become the agents. He could not enter the world inside Pujol's head and speak with the voices that lived there. That was Pujol's alone. That was the gift that made him irreplaceable. In the autumn of 1943, Berlin sent a message that made Pujol's blood run cold. They wanted to meet. They wanted to send an agent to London, a trusted courier who could make contact with Arabelle in person, who could receive his reports directly, who could provide him with new codes and new money and new instructions face to face. The message was polite, even deferential. It acknowledged the danger of such a meeting, the risk to their most valued agent. But it made clear that Berlin considered the contact necessary. They wanted to see their asset. They wanted to shake his hand. Pujol read the message and felt the room spin. This was the nightmare, the scenario he had dreaded since the beginning. If a German agent came to London, if they tried to meet, there would be no Arabelle to find. There would only be a small Spanish man in a North London flat, a man who had never been to Glasgow, never recruited a Venezuelan student, never built a network of 27 agents spread across Britain. The Germans would know immediately. The game would end. And the end would not be gentle. Harris read the message and thought. This was not the end, he said. This was an opportunity. The Germans wanted to send an agent to London. Fine. Let them send him. British intelligence would be waiting. They would intercept the agent the moment he arrived. They would arrest him, question him, turn him if possible. And then they would have a new channel, a new way to feed deception directly into the German system. The meeting would not destroy Arabelle. It would make him stronger. Pujol listened to Harris's calm analysis and felt some of the fear recede. Harris was right. This was not a threat. It was an opportunity. But the fear did not disappear entirely. It could not disappear. It was part of him now, woven into the fabric of his daily existence. He had been living a lie for so long that the lie had become his life. He could not imagine any other way of being. He could not imagine safety, peace, the ordinary existence of ordinary men. He was Arabelle now. Arabelle was him. And Arabelle was the man the Germans most trusted, the man whose words moved armies, the man who would decide where the next great battle of the war would be fought. The German agent never came. For reasons the British never fully understood, Berlin cancelled the meeting at the last moment. Perhaps they decided the risk was too great. Perhaps they had other channels they trusted more. Perhaps they simply forgot, or got distracted, or decided that written reports were enough. Pujol never knew. He only knew that the danger passed, that the nightmare receded, that he could continue his work without the terror of a personal encounter he could never survive. But the work itself was changing. Norway was only the beginning. The Germans were already asking new questions about different places, about the coast of France, about the ports of Calais and Boulogne, and the beaches of Normandy. They were beginning to suspect that the invasion would come not in the north but in the west, not in Norway, but across the narrow channel that separated England from France. They needed to know where. They needed to know when. They needed to know everything. And Juan Pujol Garcia, the poultry farmer from Barcelona, the rejected volunteer, the man who had built an empire of lies from a single room in Lisbon, was the only person who could tell them. He sat in his flat in North London, surrounded by maps and code books, and the letters from men who trusted him with their secrets, and he prepared for the greatest deception the world had ever seen. The war was entering its final phase, and he was right at the center of it. The winter of 1943 settled over London, like a gray blanket, damp and cold and heavy with the weight of waiting. Juan Pujol sat in his flat and watched the rain trace patterns on the window glass, and thought about the thousands of men huddled in barracks across southern England. Men who did not know they were part of a story he was writing. They thought they were training for invasion, for the great crossing that would finally carry the war back to Europe. They did not know that their existence, their movements, their very presence on the map was being used as raw material for fiction. They did not know that a Spanish man they would never meet was weaving them into a narrative designed to convince the German High Command that the invasion would come not where it was really coming, but somewhere else entirely. The somewhere else was Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, where the white cliffs of Dover faced the French coast across just 20 miles of water. It was the obvious place for an invasion. The Germans knew it was obvious. They had built their strongest defenses there, their heaviest fortifications, their most concentrated troop concentrations. They expected the Allies to come at Calais because it was the shortest crossing, the quickest route to the heart of Europe, the logical choice for any commander planning an amphibious assault. The Allies wanted them to expect that. They wanted the Germans to look at Calais and see the future. Because the future was actually happening somewhere else, at a place called Normandy, where the beaches were longer, and the defenses were weaker, and the Germans were not looking. Pujol's task was to make them look away. To make them keep looking at Calais even after the first boats touched sand in Normandy. To make them believe that Normandy was a feint, a diversion, a sacrifice designed to draw their reserves away from the real invasion that would come later, at Calais, where Patton was waiting with his phantom army and his imaginary tanks and his fictional divisions that existed only in the reports Pujol sent to Berlin. The scale of the deception was almost incomprehensible. Pujol was not working alone anymore. He was part of something enormous, a vast machinery of lies that included radio operators broadcasting fake traffic, inflatable tanks parked in fields where German reconnaissance planes could photograph them, dummy landing craft assembled in ports where German spies could count them. There were entire divisions that existed only on paper, with unit designations and order of battle, and commanders who gave interviews and wrote letters, and never once led real men into real combat. There was General George Patton, the most aggressive commander in the Allied arsenal, stationed in southeastern England, where everyone could see him, where his presence screamed that something big was coming from that direction, something that needed the fiercest fighter the Americans had. Pujol's job was to connect all these pieces into a coherent picture that the Germans would believe. He was the interpreter, the explainer, the source who could tie together all the threads of deception and present them as truth. His agents reported on Patton's activities, on the buildup in the southeast, on the training exercises that involved crossing water and assaulting beaches. They reported on the supply dumps and the fuel depots and the endless columns of trucks moving toward the coast. They reported on everything the Germans needed to see, everything that would confirm their belief that Calais was the target. But they also reported on Normandy. This was the most delicate part of the deception, the part that required the finest touch. Pujol could not ignore Normandy completely. The Germans would notice if their best agent in Britain never mentioned the place where hundreds of thousands of troops were actually gathering. So he mentioned it, but in a specific way. His agents reported on the Normandy buildup as well, but they reported it as a secondary effort, a smaller force, a preparation for a diversionary attack that would precede the main event. They reported that the troops in the southwest were less experienced, less well-equipped, less ready for combat. They reported that the officers there talked about their mission as a sacrifice, a way to draw German attention away from the real invasion at Calais. The Germans read these reports and saw exactly what they wanted to see. They wanted to believe that Calais was the main target because that was where they were strongest, where they were most prepared, where they had the best chance of throwing the Allies back into the sea. They wanted to believe that Normandy was a feint, because that justified their defensive dispositions, their concentration of forces in the east, their decision to leave the western beaches relatively lightly guarded. Pujol gave them what they wanted, and they thanked him for it. In Berlin, the reports from Arabelle were treated as gospel. They were circulated among the highest levels of command, studied by intelligence analysts, discussed in strategy meetings where the future of the war was decided. The Abwehr had other sources in Britain, other agents sending other reports, but none of them were as trusted as Arabelle. None of them had his track record, his consistency, his apparent access to the highest levels of Allied planning. When other sources contradicted him, the Germans assumed the other sources were wrong. When other sources confirmed him, the Germans felt their confidence justified. Arabelle was their star. Arabelle was their truth. Arabelle was the man who would tell them where the invasion was coming, and they would believe him even if every other sign pointed somewhere else. The pressure on Pujol became almost unbearable. He was writing the script, for the largest military operation in history. And if he made a single mistake, if he wrote one sentence that rang false, the consequences would be measured in thousands of lives. He lay awake at night, running through his reports in his mind, checking for inconsistencies, for contradictions, for anything the Germans might notice. He imagined himself as a German intelligence officer, reading his own reports with suspicion, looking for the crack that would reveal the lie. He could not find one. He had trained himself too well. He had become too good at this. But the fear remained, a constant presence in the background of every moment. Thomas Harris was there through all of it. He came to the flat almost every day, sometimes twice a day, bringing news from the war rooms and intelligence briefings that Pujol could never attend. He sat across the table from Pujol and helped him craft the next report, the next piece of the puzzle, the next confirmation of the lie that was becoming truth through sheer repetition. Harris understood the psychology of deception better than anyone Pujol had ever met. He knew that the best lies were not completely false, but mostly true, with just enough truth to make the falsehood believable. He knew that the Germans would not trust a source who told them only what they wanted to hear. So Pujol's agents sometimes reported bad news, sometimes reported German victories, sometimes reported things that made the Allies look weak or divided or uncertain. These reports were the most important of all. They were the proof that Arabelle was honest, that he reported what he saw even when it hurt, that he was not merely a propagandist, but a genuine intelligence asset. In the spring of 1944, the pace accelerated. The invasion was coming. Everyone knew it, though only a handful of men knew exactly when and where. Pujol was not among them. He did not need to know. His job was not to report the truth, but to sell the lie, and the lie required that he not know too much. He worked from the materials Harris brought him, the carefully curated fragments of real information that would be woven into the fictional tapestry. He worked from his own imagination, his understanding of what the Germans would believe, his instinct for the details that made a story real. The reports went out almost daily now, sometimes more than once a day. The Germans could not get enough. They asked for more, always deeper, always more specific. They wanted to know about the divisions massing in the southeast, their commanders, their equipment, their state of readiness. They wanted to know about the landing craft, the numbers, the types, the ports where they were concentrated. They wanted to know about the air forces, the naval forces, the supply arrangements that would support an invasion of the French coast. Pujol gave them everything they asked for, everything they needed to confirm their assumptions, everything that would keep them looking at Calais while the real storm gathered over Normandy. The strain showed in his body. He lost weight. His hands trembled sometimes when he wrote. He had headaches that lasted for days, a constant pressure behind his eyes that no medicine could relieve. He smoked constantly, though he had never smoked before the war. He drank coffee by the pot, needing the caffeine to stay alert through the long nights of writing and encoding and preparing reports for transmission. He looked in the mirror sometimes and did not recognize the face that looked back. It was older, thinner, more lined than the face of the man who had walked into the British embassy in Madrid 3 years earlier. That man had been hopeful, idealistic, certain that he could make a difference. This man knew that he could make a difference, but he also knew the cost. In May of 1944, with the invasion weeks away, Pujol received a message from Berlin that made his heart stop. The Germans had learned something. They had learned that a senior Allied officer had been captured, or had defected, or had been turned. The message was vague, deliberately unclear, but its meaning was unmistakable. The Germans believed they had a new source, someone inside the Allied command who could confirm or contradict the reports from Arabelle. Pujol read the message and felt the floor drop beneath him. If this new source was real, if he actually existed, if he told the Germans that Arabelle was lying, the game would end in an instant. The invasion would be compromised. The troops would land on beaches where the Germans were waiting. Thousands would die. He showed the message to Harris. Harris read it in silence, then read it again. He looked up at Pujol, and for the first time since they had met, Pujol saw uncertainty in his eyes. Harris did not know if the new source was real. He did not know if the Germans had actually penetrated the Allied command. He did not know if everything they had built was about to collapse. He only knew that they had to wait, to watch, to see what happened next. The days that followed were the longest of Pujol's life. He continued to send reports, continued to maintain the fiction, continued to do his job as if nothing had changed. But inside, he was falling apart. Every hour brought the possibility of discovery. Every message from Berlin could be the one that exposed him. Every knock on the door could be the knock that ended everything. He slept in fits and starts, never more than an hour at a time, always waking with his heart pounding and his mind racing through the possibilities of disaster. Then, a week later, another message arrived. The new source had been evaluated. The new source had been questioned. The new source had been found unreliable, possibly a plant, possibly a double agent working for the Allies. The Germans had decided to disregard his information. They would continue to rely on Arabelle, their most trusted asset, the man who had never given them reason to doubt. Pujol read the message and wept. He sat at his table with tears running down his face, unable to stop, unable to explain to Harris why he was crying. It was relief, yes, but it was more than relief. It was the release of tension that had been building for years, the sudden recognition that he had survived again, that the danger had passed again, that he could continue to do the work that gave his life meaning. He wept for the men who would live because the Germans had believed him. He wept for the men who would die anyway, because war was war, and no amount of deception could save everyone. He wept for himself, for the person he had been and the person he had become, for the ordinary life he would never have, and the extraordinary life that had chosen him. When the crying stopped, he wiped his face and lit a cigarette and looked at Harris. Harris nodded. There was nothing to say. They both knew what came next. The invasion was days away. The Germans were waiting for it, watching for it, preparing for it. They believed it would come at Calais. They believed it because Pujol had told them so. Now the only thing left was to see if they would keep believing after the first boats touched sand at Normandy. Pujol picked up his pen and began to write. The night of June 5th, 1944, was clear over the English Channel. Moonlight painted silver paths on the water below, and a wind from the southwest pushed clouds across the sky in patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Juan Pujol could not see any of it from his flat in North London. He could only sit at his table with a cigarette burning forgotten in his hand and stare at the wall as if he could see through it, through the city, through the darkness, all the way to the coast of France, where thousands of men were climbing into boats that would carry them toward the most important day of the century. He had not slept in 2 days. He could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw beaches, not the real beaches of Normandy, but the beaches in his imagination, crowded with men and machines in the chaos of combat. He saw Germans waiting behind concrete walls, aiming guns at the water, ready to kill. He saw his own reports in German hands, reports that said Calais was the target, reports that said Normandy was a feint, reports that had convinced the German High Command to keep their best divisions in the east, while the real invasion fell on the west. He did not know if they had believed him. He could not know until the sun rose over France and revealed whether the Germans were fighting on the right beaches or the wrong ones. In the hours before dawn, the first paratroopers dropped from the sky into the darkness behind Utah Beach. They landed in fields and marshes, scattered by wind and flak, alone and lost and terrified. Behind them, the greatest armada ever assembled, moved through the night toward the Norman coast. Nearly 7,000 vessels, carrying over 150,000 men, with thousands more in the air above them. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history, and it was happening exactly where the Germans were not expecting it. Pujol knew the broad outlines of the plan, but not the details. He did not need to know. His part was already played. The reports were sent. The deception was complete. Now all that remained was to wait and see if the Germans would react the way he had predicted, if they would hold their reserves at Calais while the beachheads were established, if they would continue to believe in the phantom army of General Patton long enough for the real army to get ashore. Dawn came slowly over England, gray and wet and cold. Pujol stood at his window and watched the light spread across the rooftops and thought about the men on the other side of the channel, the men who were right now wading through bullet-swept water toward beaches with names like Omaha and Gold and Juno. He thought about the German soldiers waiting for them, the ones who were in the right place at the right time, because their commanders had guessed correctly, or been lucky, or simply followed their orders. He thought about the ones who were not there, the ones sitting in reserve near Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The first reports reached London by mid-morning. They were chaotic, confused, full of the static of combat and the fog of war. Some beaches were going well, others were disasters. Omaha Beach was a slaughterhouse, men dying in waves, the water running red, the whole operation hanging by a thread. Pujol heard these reports and felt something twist inside him. He had done everything he could. He had given the Germans every reason to believe. But belief was not certainty. Belief was not action. The Germans might still move their reserves, might still see through the deception, might still rush their best divisions to Normandy in time to throw the invasion back into the sea. In Berlin, the situation was even more confused. The first news of the landings reached Hitler's headquarters at around the same time it reached London. But the interpretation was very different. The German High Command had been expecting an invasion for months, but they had been expecting it at Calais. Now here was news of landings in Normandy, 200 miles to the west. What did it mean? Was this the main attack, or a diversion? Should they commit their reserves, or hold them back? The arguments raged through the morning and into the afternoon, generals shouting at each other, intelligence officers waving reports, everyone looking for the answer that would tell them what to do. One of the reports they consulted was from Arabelle. Pujol had sent it days earlier, a comprehensive assessment of Allied intentions that concluded, with great confidence, that the Normandy landings would be a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the real invasion at Calais. The report was detailed, logical, consistent with everything else Arabelle had ever sent. It was exactly what the Germans wanted to hear. And because they wanted to hear it, because it confirmed their own fears and assumptions, they believed it. The decision was made. The reserves would not move. The panzer divisions waiting near Calais would stay where they were. The troops in Normandy would have to fight with what they had, without reinforcement, without the weight of Germany's best armored forces. The Führer himself approved the decision. He was sleeping when the news of the invasion arrived, and his aides were too afraid to wake him. By the time he woke and gave his approval for the reserves to move, hours had passed, critical hours, hours that would never come back. Pujol knew none of this as he sat in his flat on the evening of June 6th. He only knew that the reports from Normandy were still confused, still contradictory, still impossible to interpret. He lit cigarette after cigarette and watched the smoke curl toward the ceiling and tried not to think about what was happening on the other side of the channel. He tried not to think about the men dying on the beaches, the men who might live or die based in part on whether the Germans believed the lies he had told. He tried not to think about responsibility, about consequences, about the weight of what he had done. Thomas Harris came to the flat late that night. His face was gray with exhaustion, but his eyes held something Pujol had not seen before. Hope. Real hope. He sat across from Pujol and told him what the intelligence services had learned. The German reserves had not moved. The panzer divisions were still sitting at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The beachheads were holding, barely, but they were holding. And every hour that passed made them stronger, made the German position weaker, made the success of the invasion more likely. Pujol listened and felt something break inside him. Not break in the sense of damage, but break in the sense of release. The tension that had been building for years, that had become a permanent part of his existence, suddenly loosened its grip. He was not free, would never be free as long as the war continued, but he was lighter than he had been in a very long time. The deception had worked. The Germans had believed him. The men on the beaches had a chance. The next days were a blur of reports and messages and the constant flow of information from both sides of the channel. Pujol continued to send reports to Berlin, maintaining his cover, playing his role. But now his reports had a new purpose. He had to convince the Germans that the Normandy landings were indeed a feint, that the main invasion was still coming at Calais, that they must not move their reserves no matter what happened in the West. It was the most delicate part of the deception, the part that required the finest touch. If he pushed too hard, the Germans might suspect. If he did not push hard enough, they might move their forces anyway. He had to find the exact balance, the precise calibration of information that would keep them believing. He wrote about the divisions still waiting in southeastern England, the ones that had not yet been committed to battle. He wrote about Patton, still visible, still active, still preparing for his own invasion. He wrote about the supply dumps and the landing craft and the endless preparations that could only mean one thing. The Normandy operation was tough, costly, perhaps even failing, but it was not the main event. The main event was still to come. The Germans must be patient. The Germans must hold their strength. The Germans must wait for the real blow to fall. And they did. They waited through June 7th, through June 8th, through the first critical week of the invasion. They waited while the Allies built up their forces in Normandy, while the beachheads expanded and connected, while the ports were opened and the supplies flowed in. They waited while the opportunity to crush the invasion slipped away, hour by hour, day by day, until it was gone forever. On June 10th, a message arrived from Berlin that Pujol would remember for the rest of his life. It was addressed to Arabelle personally, marked with the highest classification, signed by an officer whose name Pujol had never seen, but whose authority was unmistakable. The message thanked him for his reports, praised his analysis, confirmed that his information had been crucial in the decision to hold the reserves at Calais. It assured him that his work was appreciated at the highest levels of command. It promised that when the war was won, he would be rewarded beyond his imagination. Pujol read the message and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, no joy. He felt only a vast emptiness, a hollow space where emotion should have been. He had done what he set out to do. He had helped the Allies, hurt the Germans, made a difference in the largest event of his time. But the cost was incalculable. The years of fear, the isolation, the constant pressure, the weight of responsibility. He had become someone else, someone who could live a lie so completely that the truth was only a memory. He did not know if he could ever go back to being the man he had been. Harris found him still sitting at the table, the message in front of him, his face empty. He sat down without speaking and waited. After a long moment, Pujol looked up. He did not say anything about the message, about the praise, about the promise of reward. He only asked one question. How many men had died on the beaches of Normandy? Harris did not know the exact number. No one knew yet. But he knew it was thousands. Pujol nodded. He thought about those thousands, the ones who had fallen, the ones whose lives had been given for the success of the invasion. He thought about the ones who might have died if the Germans had moved their reserves, if the deception had failed, if he had made a mistake. He thought about the ones who would die in the weeks and months ahead as the Allies fought their way across France toward the final defeat of Nazi Germany. Then he picked up his pen and began to write the next report. There was no time for reflection, no space for emotion. The war was not over. The deception was not complete. The Germans still believed in Arabelle, still trusted him, still relied on his information. He would give them what they wanted for as long as it took. He would play his role until the curtain fell. He would be Arabelle until there was no more need for Arabelle to exist. Outside the window, the London night was quiet. No bombs fell. No sirens wailed. The city that had endured so much was finally safe, or as safe as any city could be in wartime. Pujol wrote by the light of a single lamp, his pen moving across the paper in the careful script the Germans had come to trust. He wrote about Patton, about Calais, about the invasion that was still coming, still waiting, still imminent. He wrote the lies that would save lives, and the lies that would cost lives, and the lies that would become history. And when he finished, he sat back and lit another cigarette and waited for the next message from Berlin. The game was not over. It would not be over until the war was over. But the hardest part was done. The longest day had passed, and Juan Pujol Garcia, the poultry farmer from Barcelona, the man who talked himself into war, had helped change the course of history from a small flat in North London, armed with nothing but paper and ink and the power of a story so convincing that an entire army believed it. The weeks after D-Day were the strangest of Juan Pujol's life. The invasion he had spent years preparing for was finally happening, and yet his work was far from over. In some ways, it was just beginning. The Germans still believed in Arabelle. They still trusted him. They still looked to his reports for guidance on where the next blow would fall. And Pujol, sitting in his flat in North London, continued to feed them the lies they craved. But the lies had changed. Before D-Day, Pujol's job was to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais. After D-Day, his job was to convince them that the Normandy landings were only the beginning, that the real invasion was still coming, that they must not move their reserves from Pas de Calais, no matter what happened in the West. It was a delicate balance, a high-wire act without a net. If he pushed too hard, the Germans might suspect they were being played. If he did not push hard enough, they might release their divisions to fight in Normandy, where they could do real damage to the Allied forces struggling to break out of the beachheads. The reports continued to flow. Pujol's imaginary agents reported on the divisions still waiting in southeastern England, the ones that had not yet been committed to battle. They reported on General Patton, still visible, still active, still preparing for his own invasion. They reported on the supply dumps and the landing craft and the endless preparations that could only mean one thing. The Normandy operation was tough, costly, perhaps even failing. But it was not the main event. The main event was still to come. The Germans must be patient. The Germans must hold their strength. The Germans must wait for the real blow to fall. In Berlin, the reports from Arabelle were studied with desperate attention. The German High Command was in chaos, torn between the evidence of their eyes and the assurances of their most trusted agent. Their eyes told them that Normandy was a major invasion, perhaps the main invasion, perhaps the only invasion. But Arabelle told them something different. Arabelle told them that Normandy was a diversion, that Patton was waiting with 1,000,000 men and 10,000 tanks, that the real blow would fall at Calais any day now. They did not know which to believe. They did not know who to trust. So they did what desperate men always do. They tried to believe both. They sent some reinforcements to Normandy, but held most back at Calais. They committed enough to slow the Allied advance, but not enough to stop it. They made the worst possible choice, the choice that satisfied no one and accomplished nothing. Pujol knew nothing of these deliberations. He only knew that the Germans were still listening, still responding, still asking for more. The messages from Berlin continued to arrive, full of praise and gratitude and requests for additional information. They told him that his reports were being read at the highest levels, that his analysis was considered essential, that he was making a difference in ways he could not imagine. They did not tell him that his lies were tying down hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who could have been fighting in Normandy. They did not tell him that every day he kept the reserves at Calais was another day. The Allies could build their strength, expand their beachheads, prepare for the breakout that would eventually come. He had to infer that from the silence, from the absence of panzer divisions on the Norman front, from the slow but steady progress of the Allied armies pushing inland from the coast. The summer of 1944 was hot in London, hotter than anyone could remember. Pujol sat in his flat with the windows open, trying to catch any breeze that might stir, and wrote report after report in his careful script. The heat made it hard to concentrate, hard to think, hard to maintain the intricate web of fiction that had become his life. He drank water by the pitcher and smoked cigarettes by the pack and watched the sweat drip onto the paper as he wrote. He did not complain. He did not allow himself to complain. The men fighting in Normandy were sleeping in mud and dying in hedgerows and suffering in ways he could not imagine. The least he could do was suffer a little heat. In July, the Allies finally broke out of the beachheads. The Normandy front, which had been static for weeks, suddenly exploded into movement as American armored divisions poured through a gap in the German lines and began racing across France. The Germans, caught off balance and lacking the reserves to respond, fell back in confusion. Paris was liberated in August. By September, the Allies were approaching the German border. The war, which had seemed so far from ending just months earlier, now appeared to have a limit, a horizon, a point at which it would finally stop. Pujol watched these developments with a mixture of hope and dread. Hope because the end was finally in sight. Dread because his work was not done. The Germans still believed in Arabelle. They still trusted him. They still sent messages asking for information, for guidance, for the insights that had served them so well throughout the war. He could not simply stop. He could not disappear. He had to maintain the fiction until the very end, until the moment when the war was over, and it no longer mattered what the Germans believed. The messages from Berlin grew more desperate as the months passed. The German army was collapsing on all fronts, crushed between the Western Allies and the Soviet steamroller. But still they asked about Calais. Still they asked about Patton. Still they asked about the phantom army that had never existed, the invasion that had never come, the threat that had kept their best divisions idle while the real war passed them by. Pujol answered every message, provided every report, maintained every fiction. He did not know if they still believed him. He did not know if they had finally figured out the truth. He only knew that as long as they kept asking, he had to keep answering. In November of 1944, a message arrived that made Pujol's blood run cold. The Germans wanted to reward him. They wanted to honor their most trusted agent, the man whose reports had guided them through the darkest days of the war. They were sending a decoration, a medal, the Iron Cross, personally authorized by the Führer himself. It would be delivered through channels, passed from hand to hand, until it reached Arabelle in London. They wanted him to know that his service was appreciated, that his sacrifice was recognized, that he would never be forgotten. Pujol read the message and felt the absurdity of it wash over him. The Germans were going to give him a medal. They were going to decorate him for his service to the Reich, for his years of loyal reporting, for his invaluable contribution to the German war effort. And the medal would come to him in London. where he sat in a flat paid for by British intelligence, writing reports that had helped destroy the German army in France. It was so perfect, so beautifully ironic, that he almost laughed. Almost. But the laughter would not come. It got stuck somewhere in his throat and turned into something else. Something that felt like grief. Thomas Harris came to the flat when he heard the news. He sat across from Pujol, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Harris reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He slid it across the table. Inside was a medal, the Iron Cross, second class. It had arrived through diplomatic channels, passed from the German embassy in Stockholm to the British embassy to MY5 to Harris. It was real. It was actually real. The Germans had actually sent it. Pujol picked up the medal and held it in his hand. It was heavier than he expected. Cold. Solid. He turned it over and looked at the inscription, the swastika, the eagle, the symbols of everything he hated. This was what the Germans thought of him. This was how they valued him. This was the reward for years of lies, years of fear, years of isolation. He put the medal back in the box and closed the lid. He did not know what to feel. He did not know if he should feel proud or ashamed, or simply empty. He felt all of them at once, and none of them at all. Harris told him that the British wanted to give him a medal too. The king wanted to recognize his service, his sacrifice, his contribution to the victory that was finally within sight. They were offering the Order of the British Empire, one of the highest honors the country could bestow. Pujol would become the only person in history to receive decorations from both sides in the same war. It was an extraordinary distinction, a testament to the uniqueness of his achievement. But Pujol did not care about medals. He cared about the war ending. He cared about going home. He cared about becoming himself again, whoever that was. The winter of 1944 was the coldest in memory. Snow fell on London, covering the bomb sites and the broken buildings in a blanket of white that almost made the city look beautiful. Pujol sat in his flat and watched the snow fall and thought about Spain. He thought about the sun, the heat, the dry earth of his homeland. He thought about his wife and his son, whom he had not seen in years, whom he barely remembered. He thought about the life he had left behind, the ordinary life of a poultry farmer, the life he had chosen to abandon, for something bigger, something more important, something that had consumed him entirely. He did not regret it. He could not regret it. He had done what he set out to do. He had fought the fascists with the only weapons he had. He had made a difference. He had helped save lives, thousands of lives, perhaps tens of thousands. But the cost was higher than he had ever imagined. He had given up everything, including himself. He did not know if there was anything left to go back to. The messages from Berlin continued through the winter and into the spring of 1945. But they grew thinner, more desperate, more disconnected from reality. The German army was collapsing. The Russian army was at the gates of Berlin. Hitler was hiding in his bunker, giving orders to armies that no longer existed. And still they asked about Calais. Still they asked about Patton. Still they asked about the phantom invasion that had never come. Pujol answered every message, provided every report, maintained every fiction. It felt almost cruel now, like kicking a dying man. But he did it anyway. He did it because the war was not over until it was over, and until then, every lie he told was one more German division kept out of the fight, one more life saved on the Allied side. In April of 1945, the messages stopped. Not gradually, not with any explanation. They just stopped. One day, there was a message, and the next day, there was nothing, and the day after that, still nothing. Pujol waited, checking the radio frequencies, watching for the familiar patterns of German communication. Nothing came. The silence stretched into days, then weeks. He realized slowly that it was over. The Germans had finally been defeated. The war in Europe was ending, and Arabelle, the most trusted agent of the Abwehr, had no one left to report to. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. Pujol stood at his window and listened to the celebrations in the streets below, the singing and the shouting and the sheer joy of a city that had endured so much and finally reached the end. He did not join them. He could not join them. He stood alone in his flat and watched the people celebrate and felt nothing but exhaustion. The war was over. He had survived. He had done what he set out to do. But the man who had started this journey, the idealistic Spaniard who walked into the British embassy in Madrid, was gone. In his place was someone else, someone who had spent years living inside a fiction, someone who did not know how to live any other way. Thomas Harris came to the flat that night. They sat together in the silence, two men who had shared something that no one else could understand. Harris had brought a bottle of whiskey, and they drank it slowly, without talking, watching the lights of the celebrating city through the window. Finally, Harris spoke. He said that Pujol's work was recognized, that his contribution was incalculable, that history would remember what he had done. Pujol nodded. He appreciated the words. He knew they were true. But they did not change the emptiness inside him. The next day, he received a letter. It was from the British government, formal and official, confirming that he had been awarded the Order of the British Empire. He would receive it at a ceremony if he wished, or it could be sent to him. He read the letter and put it aside. He did not care about ceremonies. He did not care about medals. He cared about going home. But going home was not simple. Spain was still ruled by Franco, the fascist dictator Pujol had spent the war fighting against. He could not return there safely. His family might be in danger. His life might be in danger. He was a hero to the Allies, but a traitor to the regime that still controlled his homeland. He had no country to go back to. He had no home. He had only the flat in North London, the memories of the war, and the strange, hollow feeling that came from spending years as someone else. He sat at his table and looked at the map of Britain still pinned to the wall, covered in the markings that represented his imaginary agents, his fictional network, his years of lies. He reached up and took it down. He folded it carefully and put it in a drawer. He did not need it anymore. The war was over. The lies could stop. But as he closed the drawer, he wondered if the lies had ever really been separate from himself. He wondered if Arabelle had taken over so completely that Juan Pujol no longer existed. He wondered if he would ever find out. The war ended, but the silence did not bring peace. Juan Pujol sat in his flat day after day, watching the ordinary life of London resume around him, and felt more lost than he had ever felt during the fighting. The war had given him purpose, direction, a reason to be someone other than himself. Now that it was over, he had nothing to replace it. He was a man without a country, without a future, without any clear idea of who he was supposed to be. The British government had promised to help him. They had given him a new identity, a new name, a new life that would protect him from the vengeance of the Nazis, who might still be looking for the traitor who had destroyed their most trusted network. But the new identity felt like another lie, another fiction, another mask to wear. He had spent so long being Arabelle that he no longer knew how to be anyone else. The British gave him papers that said he was someone named something, some ordinary name that he forgot almost immediately, and told him he could live anywhere he wanted as long as it was far from Europe and far from anyone who might recognize him. He chose Venezuela. It was far, it was warm, it was a place where no one would look for a Spanish poultry farmer who had become the most important double agent of the war. He packed his few belongings, the code books, and the letters, and the medal the Germans had given him, the Iron Cross that he kept in a box at the bottom of his suitcase. He did not know why he kept it. Perhaps as proof that it had all been real, perhaps as a reminder of the absurdity of war, perhaps because he could not bear to throw away any piece of the life he was leaving behind. The voyage to South America took weeks. Pujol stood on the deck of the ship and watched the coast of Europe disappear over the horizon, and felt nothing. No sadness, no relief, no anticipation, just the same emptiness that had been with him since the war ended. He tried to imagine what his new life would look like, the ordinary existence of an ordinary man in an ordinary country. He could not picture it. He had spent too long living inside his head, inside the world of his imagination, to imagine anything so simple as a normal life. Venezuela in 1945 was a country of oil and coffee and vast open spaces where a man could lose himself if he wanted to. Pujol found a small house on the edge of a small town, a place with a garden and a view of the mountains, and the kind of silence that had been missing from his life for years. He planted vegetables. He kept chickens, because chickens were what he knew, what he had done before the war, what connected him to the person he had been before everything changed. He lived alone, spoke to no one, watched the days pass in a rhythm so slow it felt like another kind of death. But the past would not leave him alone. In 1949, a German journalist tracking the history of the Abwehr stumbled across references to a mysterious agent named Arabelle, a Spaniard who had been the most trusted source in Britain throughout the war. The journalist began asking questions, following leads, digging into archives that no one had touched since the surrender. He traced the story to Venezuela, to a small town where a quiet man kept chickens and spoke to no one. He found Pujol and asked for an interview. Pujol refused. He did not want to talk about the war. He did not want to remember. He wanted only to be left alone. But the journalist was persistent. He came back again and again, each time with new questions, new information, new pieces of the puzzle that he wanted Pujol to confirm or deny. Finally, after months of refusal, Pujol agreed to talk. He did not know why. Perhaps he was tired of hiding. Perhaps he wanted someone to know the truth. Perhaps he simply needed to tell the story to someone who would understand. The journalist listened for days as Pujol told the whole story. The rejection in Madrid, the recruitment by the Abwehr, the years in Lisbon building an empire of lies, the move to London, the partnership with Harris, the deception that had kept German divisions pinned in Norway and Calais, while the Allies landed in Normandy. The Iron Cross from Hitler and the OBE from the King. The strange emptiness of survival. The journalist wrote it all down, checking facts, verifying details, building a narrative that would eventually become a book. When the book was published, the world learned for the first time about the man who had fooled Hitler. Pujol's name was in newspapers across Europe and America. He was called a hero, a genius, the greatest double agent of the war. Letters arrived from strangers, from veterans, from people who wanted to thank him for the lives he had saved. Some of them were addressed to his real name, some to his cover name, some simply to the man in Venezuela who had tricked the Nazis. Pujol read them all and felt nothing. The gratitude of strangers could not fill the emptiness inside him. In the 1950s, he moved again, this time to Angola, another distant place, another country where no one would know him. He opened a small bookshop, sold books to people who did not know they were buying from the most famous spy of the war. He married again, had children, tried to build the ordinary life that had always eluded him. But the past followed him even there. Journalists found him. Historians found him. Researchers who wanted to document every detail of the deception found him. He talked to some, refused others, tried to control the story that was no longer his to control. The truth was that he had never stopped being Arabelle, the man who had invented 27 imaginary agents, who had lived inside their lives for years, who had become so skilled at deception that he could convince anyone of anything, had lost the ability to be simply himself. He did not know who that self was. He had spent so long being someone else that the original had disappeared. The chickens, the garden, the bookshop, the wife and children, all of it felt like another performance, another role, another mask. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, a group of veterans invited him to Normandy for the anniversary of the invasion. They wanted to honor him, to thank him, to let him stand on the beaches where so many had died and see what his lies had made possible. Pujol hesitated. He had avoided such events for decades. But something made him say yes this time. Perhaps it was age. Perhaps it was the recognition that he would not have many more chances. Perhaps it was the need to finally see the place that had been at the center of his thoughts for so long. He stood on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1984, an old man in a suit, looking out at the water where the boats had come 40 years earlier. The beach was peaceful now, full of tourists and families and the kind of ordinary life that war destroys. He tried to imagine what it had looked like on that morning, the chaos and the blood and the terror. He could not. The imagination that had served him so well, that had built empires of lies and fooled the German high command, could not recreate the reality of that day. He was glad. Some things should not be imagined. Veterans came up to him, old men now, their uniforms replaced by civilian clothes, their eyes still holding the memories of what they had seen. They shook his hand. They thanked him. Some of them cried. They told him that they might not be alive, if not for his lies, that their children might not exist, that their entire lives were built on the foundation of the deception he had created. Pujol listened to them and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt that it had been worth it. All the fear, all the isolation, all the loss of self, it had been worth it for these men, for their children, for the world they had helped build. He returned to Angola after the ceremony. He went back to his bookshop, his chickens, his ordinary life. But something had changed. The emptiness was still there, but it was smaller now, less consuming. He had seen what his lies had made possible. He had looked into the eyes of men who owed their lives to his imagination. He had stood on the beach where history had turned, and he had known finally that his part in it had mattered. In 1988, he moved one last time, back to Europe, to a small town in France, not far from the beaches he had visited 4 years earlier. He wanted to be close to the place where his work had reached its climax. He wanted to spend his remaining years in sight of the channel that had been the focus of so much of his life. He bought a small house, planted a garden, kept a few chickens. He lived quietly, visited occasionally by historians and journalists, but mostly alone with his memories. On October 10th, 1988, Juan Pujol Garcia died. He was 76 years old. The news of his death spread through the intelligence community, through the historical societies, through the small circle of people who knew what he had done. Obituaries appeared in newspapers across the world, calling him a hero, a genius, the man who had fooled Hitler. They told the story of his life, the rejection and the recruitment, and the years of deception, the Iron Cross and the OBE, the 27 imaginary agents who had never existed, but had changed the course of history. But the obituaries missed something. They told the story of Arabelle, the spy, the double agent, the master of deception. They did not tell the story of Juan Pujol, the man who had given up his identity to serve a cause he believed in, the man who had spent the rest of his life trying to find himself again, the man who had stood on Omaha Beach and felt, for the first time in decades, that his sacrifice had been worth it. They did not tell that story because that story was harder to tell. It had no clear ending, no neat resolution, no satisfying moral. It was just the story of a man who had done something extraordinary and then spent the rest of his life trying to live with the consequences. In a drawer in his house in France, among his few possessions, there was a small box. Inside the box was an Iron Cross, the medal Hitler had awarded to his most trusted agent. Next to it was the Order of the British Empire, the medal the king had given to the man who had helped defeat him. They lay together in the darkness, symbols of the two sides of a war that had consumed the world. Symbols of the two identities that had consumed one man. Juan Pujol Garcia was gone. But Arabelle lived on in the history books, in the memories of the veterans, in the story of the greatest deception the world had ever seen. And somewhere in between, in the space between the man and the spy, there was a life that no one would ever fully understand. The obituaries were written, the ceremonies concluded, the history books updated, to include the name of Juan Pujol Garcia among the great spies of the 20th century. But the story did not end with his death. It could not end, because the consequences of his lies were still unfolding, still reverberating through the lives of people who had never heard his name, still shaping the world in ways that no one could fully measure. In the years after his death, historians dug deeper into the archives. They found the German records, the intercepted messages, the careful documentation of the Abwehr's most trusted source. They found the British files, the MI5 reports, the correspondence between Pujol and his handler Thomas Harris. they pieced together the full scope of the deception, the 27 imaginary agents, the thousands of reports, the years of sustained fiction that had convinced the German High Command to keep hundreds of thousands of soldiers pinned in Norway and Calais, while the Allies established their beachheads in Normandy. The numbers were staggering. 13 divisions in Norway, nearly 20 in the Pas-de-Calais region, all of them waiting for an invasion that never came. More than 300,000 German soldiers, with their tanks and their artillery and their supplies, rendered irrelevant by the imagination of one man. Military historians calculated what those divisions could have done if they had been committed to the Normandy front. They could have arrived within days, perhaps hours, of the initial landings. They could have counterattacked while the Allies were still struggling to establish their beachheads, while the supply lines were still fragile, while the outcome of the invasion was still in doubt. They could have pushed the Allies back into the sea, or at least contained them in a narrow perimeter that could have been slowly strangled. The invasion of Europe, the largest amphibious operation in history, might have failed. The war might have continued for another year, another 2 years, with all the suffering and death that would have entailed. And none of it happened because a Spanish poultry farmer had convinced the Germans to look the wrong way. But the numbers only told part of the story. The rest of the story was written in the lives of the men who survived because of Pujol's lies. The American paratrooper who landed behind Utah Beach and lived to see his grandchildren. The British soldier who waited ashore at Gold Beach and went home to become a teacher, a father, a man who never knew that his life had been saved by a stranger in London. The French civilian who watched the liberation of his village and grew old in freedom instead of under occupation. They were millions, these lives, stretching out from the beaches of Normandy like ripples in a pond, touching everything and everyone in ways that could never be fully traced. There were other lives, too, the ones that Pujol thought about in the quiet moments of his long exile. The German soldiers who died because their leaders had been deceived, who fought and fell in a war that was already lost, who never knew that the intelligence they trusted was fiction. They were someone's sons, someone's fathers, someone's husbands. They died believing they were defending their homeland against an enemy that had outthought and outmaneuvered them. Pujol did not celebrate their deaths. He could not. He had seen too much death in Spain to celebrate any death anywhere. He only knew that their deaths, like the Allied deaths, were part of the cost of defeating a regime that had to be defeated. In the decades after the war, the story of Operation Fortitude became legend. Books were written, documentaries filmed, lectures delivered. The name of Juan Pujol Garcia appeared alongside the great commanders, the great battles, the great turning points of the war. He was invited to anniversaries, to ceremonies, to events where veterans shook his hand and thanked him for what he had done. He accepted some of these invitations, declined others, always aware of the distance between the legend and the man. The legend was a hero, a genius, a master of deception. The man was someone who had given up his identity and never quite found it again. Thomas Harris, his handler and friend, died in a car crash in 1964. The death was ruled an accident, but there were always rumors, always questions, always the possibility that someone had finally caught up with the men who had fooled the Reich. Pujol heard the news in Angola and felt the loss like a physical blow. Harris was the only person who truly understood what the war had cost him, the only person who had been there through the worst of it, the only person who could remind him of who he had been before the lies took over. With Harris gone, the last connection to that time, that self, was severed. He continued to live, to move, to try on different lives like suits of clothes that never quite fit. Angola, Venezuela, France. Each place offered a new version of himself, a new chance to be ordinary, a new opportunity to forget. But he could not forget. The memories were too strong, the habits too ingrained, the identity of Arabelle too deeply woven into the fabric of his being. He would catch himself inventing stories about the people he met, imagining their secret lives, constructing the kind of detailed fictions that had once fooled an empire. It was not something he chose to do. It was simply how his mind worked now, how it had learned to work during the years when survival depended on seeing everything as material for deception. In his final years in France, he lived simply quietly, an old man with a garden and a few chickens and a stack of books that he read and reread in the long afternoons. Visitors came sometimes, historians or journalists or documentary filmmakers who wanted to capture his story before it was lost. He talked to some of them, refused others, tried to control the narrative that had long since escaped his control. He was always polite, always thoughtful, always slightly distant, as if he was observing himself from somewhere else, watching the performance of being Juan Pujol with the same detachment he had once brought to the performance of being Arabelle. On clear days, he could see the channel from his window, the same channel that had carried the invasion fleets to Normandy, the same water that had separated England from France, the same stretch of sea that had been the focus of so much of his life. He would sit and watch the ships pass, the ferries and freighters and occasional sailboats, and think about the thousands of vessels that had crossed on that June morning in 1944. He thought about the men on those vessels, the ones who had survived and the ones who had not. He thought about the German soldiers waiting at Calais, watching the same water, expecting a threat that would never materialize. He thought about the strange geometry of war, the way a single lie, told well enough and often enough, could bend the path of history. The Iron Cross and the Order of the British Empire stayed in their box, side by side, symbols of a contradiction that could never be resolved. He had served both sides and neither side. He had been loyal to a cause that transcended nations, the cause of defeating fascism, and in serving that cause he had betrayed everyone who trusted him. The Germans who gave him the medal believed he was their man. The British who gave him the other medal knew he was theirs. Both were right, and both were wrong. He belonged to no one but himself, and he did not even belong to himself anymore. In the last months of his life, he began to write. Not for publication, not for history, but for himself. He wrote about the war, about the years of deception, about the people he had invented, and the lives they had lived inside his head. He wrote about the Venezuelan student in Glasgow, the Welsh radio operator, the Swiss businessman, all the imaginary agents who had been more real to him than most of the actual people he had known. He wrote about their families, their hopes, their fears, the detailed biographies he had constructed for each of them and never shared with anyone. He wrote about their deaths, the way he had quietly retired them from service as the war ended, letting them fade into the ordinary lives he had never been able to find for himself. He finished the manuscript a week before he died. He left instructions that it should be published after his death, if anyone was interested, or destroyed, if anyone thought it better. He did not care which. The writing was not for readers. It was for himself, a way of saying goodbye to the people who had lived inside him for so long, a way of releasing them into whatever afterlife awaited fictional beings. On the morning of October 10th, 1988, he woke early, as he always did. He made coffee, fed the chickens, sat in his chair by the window to watch the sun rise over the channel. The sky was clear, the water calm, the day beginning like any other. He felt tired, more tired than usual, but that was to be expected at his age. He closed his eyes for a moment, just to rest them, just to feel the warmth of the sun on his face. He did not open them again. The funeral was small, private, attended by the few people who had known him in his final years. No representatives from governments, no military honors, no ceremonies befitting a hero. He had asked for simplicity, and simplicity was what he got. They buried him in the local cemetery, under a headstone that bore his real name and the dates of his birth and death. No mention of the war, no mention of the medals, no mention of the 27 imaginary agents who had changed the course of history. But the story did not end there. It could not end, because stories like this never really end. They continue in the memories of those who hear them, in the imaginations of those who try to understand, in the endless retelling that keeps the past alive. Juan Pujol Garcia was gone, but Arabelle remained. The man who had fooled Hitler, the spy who had invented an army, the double agent who had received medals from both sides, lived on in the books and the documentaries and the conversations of historians who would never stop trying to understand how one person could do so much with nothing but paper and ink and the power of imagination. In the archives of MI5, the files on Operation Fortitude are still classified, still sealed, still protected from the eyes of historians who would like to know more. But the outlines are clear enough. The deception worked. The Germans believed. The invasion succeeded. And at the center of it all was a small Spanish man who had been rejected by the British, recruited by the Germans, and transformed into the most effective double agent of the 20th century. In the German archives, the records of the Abwehr tell a different story. They show an intelligence service that trusted its best agent completely, that built strategy around his reports, that committed hundreds of thousands of soldiers based on his information. They show a service that was fooled so completely that it never suspected the truth until it was too late. They show the consequences of belief, the way that trust, once given, is almost impossible to withdraw. In the beaches of Normandy, the tourists still come. They walk the sands where so many died, visit the cemeteries where so many are buried. Try to imagine what it must have been like on that June morning in 1944. They look at the bunkers and the gun emplacements and the monuments that mark the places where history turned. Most of them have never heard of Juan Pujol Garcia. They do not know that the success of the invasion depended in part on the lies of a man they will never meet. They do not know that the beaches they walk might have been a graveyard for the Allied cause, if not for the imagination of a Spanish poultry farmer. But some of them know. Some of them have read the books, seen the documentaries, heard the story of the man who fooled Hitler. They stand on the beaches and think about him, about the strange geometry of war, about the way that a single lie, told well enough and often enough, can change the world. They wonder what it must have been like to carry such a burden, to live inside such a fiction, to spend years as someone else, and then try to find your way back to yourself. And somewhere, in the space between the beaches and the archives, between the memory and the history, between the man and the legend, the answer waits. It is not a simple answer. It is not a comforting answer. It is just the truth, as close as anyone can come to it, about a man who gave up everything to fight a war and never quite found his way home. The pen stopped moving. The reports stopped coming. The agents stopped existing. And Juan Pujol Garcia, the man who had been Arabelle, the man who had been 27 people, the man who had been no one at all, finally found the peace that had eluded him for so long. He lay in the quiet earth of a French cemetery, within sight of the channel he had helped to cross, and the world went on without him. But the world he had helped to create, the world where fascism was defeated and freedom survived, carried his mark in ways that would never be fully measured. In the end, that was enough. It had to be enough. It was all anyone ever got.